Frank Mallory had one good leg, two shaking hands, and not quite $2,000 left in the world when he decided to risk almost all of it on a locked metal door. The motor of his wheelchair hummed softly as he rolled across the cracked pavement toward the storage facility office, an old canvas envelope tucked under his jacket like a secret. He knew very well that a man his age, alone, with his life savings in cash, had no business gambling on somebody else's abandoned junk, and yet, as he looked at the long row of blue metal doors stretching into the chilly morning, he felt something he had not felt in years. He felt curious. He had not always moved this slowly. Before the accident, Frank had been a stockroom man in a big-box home store, the kind of place where you could buy a hammer, a lawnmower, and a chandelier without ever crossing the street. He had liked the simple predictability of it, pallets in shelves filled, boxes stacked just so, everything labeled in his neat block letters. Then one rainy night a delivery truck had skidded where it shouldn't have, metal had folded in a way it wasn't meant to, and the world had split neatly into before and after. The doctors did what they could, but nerves do not always listen to talent, and by 68 he sat more than he stood, navigating life from a wheelchair that whirred instead of walking shoes that creaked. When the store finally let him go, gently, with apologies, with a cake on a paper plate, they did it because numbers did not care how loyal a man had been. Disability checks arrived, but they were never quite enough. Rent crept upward like ivy on the side of his tired little building, medications changed names but never dropped in price, and more often Frank found himself holding receipts in the kitchen light, wondering which bill could be nudged a week and which could not. The small savings he and his late sister had scraped together over the years sat in the bank like a frightened animal, shrinking a little each month no matter how carefully he tried not to touch it. The one thing he still did, partly for the discount and partly because he needed an excuse to be around people, was help out 2 days a week at a smaller supply store closer to home. They sold the usual things, paint, screws, extension cords, but tucked away along one whole aisle were the heavy-duty plastic storage bins that had become popular among the wealthy folks from the other side of town. These bins were different from the cheap ones you bought to hide winter sweaters. They were reinforced, airtight, fitted with rubber gaskets and locking lids. Doctors, lawyers, and real estate investors came in for them, talking on phones while they ordered stacks of 10 or 12 at a time, paying in cash or with gleaming cards that never declined. Frank learned to recognize the look. People who had more than they could fit in their houses, looking for extra corners to hide it in. So when a regular customer, the delivery driver from the storage facility near the wealthy district, dropped off a flyer one afternoon and mentioned casually that they were holding a lien auction on several unpaid units, the words slipped through Frank's tired mind and caught on something. The driver talked about folks who forgot to pay their bills, about doors opened in front of little crowds, about bidders peering into dark rooms from the threshold and trying to guess what might be hidden behind a stack of boxes or under a dusty tarp. Sometimes it's all junk, the man said, shrugging. But every now and then, somebody hits a real jackpot. You ought to see what people walk out with. That night, alone at his small kitchen table with a bowl of soup cooling beside him, Frank set the flyer down next to a pile of unpaid envelopes and stared at it longer than he meant to. The rational part of him tallied numbers in his head. How much he could risk, how much he could not, what it would mean if he lost everything on a foolish whim. Another part, quieter but just as persistent, remembered the neat rows of expensive bins leaving the store in the arms of people who treated $200 like pocket change. He knew which storage facility the driver had meant. He had seen the address on the invoices many times. Those bins had gone somewhere, and rich people, he had learned, did not use the cheap places. They used the ones where the monthly rent on a 10x10 unit was more than he spent on groceries. He told himself he would only go to watch, to see what it was like. Yet when morning came and the sky over the city was a flat, pale gray, he folded a worn envelope of cash into the inside pocket of his jacket and wheeled himself to the bus stop anyway. The bus ride was long and jolting, full of stops in neighborhoods he rarely visited, but he watched the buildings change carefully through the window. Corner stores gave way to coffee shops with clean glass fronts, tired porches turned into manicured lawns, and by the time the bus hissed to a halt near the storage facility, the world already smelled different, less of fried food and more of car wax and trimmed hedges. The facility itself looked tidy, almost polished, with rows of blue roll-up doors and a clean office with a pot of coffee on a side table. A small crowd had gathered in the gravel lot, resellers with clipboards, middle-aged couples wearing work gloves, a couple of men in ball caps who seemed to know each other, and the auctioneer by name. Frank stayed near the edge, awkwardly aware that his wheelchair made him stand out. He folded his hands in his lap and listened as the manager explained the rules. No stepping inside the units, cash payment at the end, 48 hours to clear whatever you bought. When the auctioneer lifted a hand and the first door rattled up, the crowd leaned forward as one. The first few units were underwhelming. One held sagging sofas and boxes that looked as if they had been moved from attic to attic for 30 years without anyone ever opening them. Another contained nothing but office chairs and an old fax machine. People still bid. There was always someone who believed they could extract a profit from anything. Frank kept his paddle down and his expression neutral, tamping down the small jitter of hope that had brought him there. He reminded himself that he was only watching, only learning, and that the envelope in his coat was not yet part of the story. Then they rolled up the door on Unit 37. From where Frank sat, the unit looked different immediately. Instead of the usual chaos of half-broken furniture and torn garbage bags, he saw a neat row of tall, reinforced plastic bins lining the back wall, stacked too high, lids facing outward with the faintly familiar logo of the brand he had lifted and shelved 1,000 times. A couple of smaller bins sat to the side, and in front of them, pushed almost politely against one wall, were two wheeled suitcases that looked like they had been expensive when they were bought. The light from the overcast sky slid along the smooth surfaces of the containers, and for a moment Frank felt as though he were back in the store aisle, watching a wealthy customer sign a receipt. He knew those bins. He knew their price, their weight, and the kind of person who usually bought them. Rich people didn't spend that kind of money to store nothing. They stored collections, equipment, seasonal wardrobes, sometimes even valuables they did not trust their own houses with. Of course, he also knew that time and disappointment had turned many such units into nothing more than strange, overbuilt closets for sentimental junk. But as he watched, he felt that small inner voice again, the one that had made him come here at all, whispering that someone had packed this unit carefully and paid its bill faithfully for years, until, for some reason, they had not. The bidding started low, almost casually, with numbers Frank could have matched without feeling his heart pound. But as the auctioneer's chant bounced across the lot, the numbers climbed. One of the regular resellers squinted at the unit, hesitated, then shook his head and stepped back. The crowd shuffled, evaluating, doing their own quiet math. Frank found his hand lifting the paddle before he had fully decided to do it. His throat felt dry, but his voice, when he called out his first bid, sounded steady enough. In that moment, his world shrank to the rectangle of concrete in front of that blue door, the bins at the back of the dark room, and the uncomfortable knowledge that he was tying his future to a guess. By the time the auctioneer called out, 600, "Do I hear 650? The field had thinned. Frank raised his paddle again, feeling more than seeing the curious glances from a few of the others. They saw an old man in a chair, sure, but what they didn't see was every paycheck, every pay stub, every uncashed vacation day that had ever passed through his hands to make up the money he was risking now. When the gavel finally fell at $850 and the auctioneer pointed in his direction, a ripple went through the small crowd, not quite surprise, not quite pity, but some mixture of the two. He paid at the office with fingers that had to be forced not to tremble, sliding bills across the counter while the manager wrote a receipt and handed him a small brass key on a plastic tag. "You've got 48 hours to clear it out," the man said, in the same even tone he'd used for everyone else. Frank nodded, slipped the key into his pocket, and rolled back out into the light, the weight of what he had just done settling slowly onto his shoulders. He had taken nearly half of what stood between him and real trouble and bet it on a row of plastic boxes. On the ride home, as the bus rattled back through poorer streets toward his building, Frank kept replaying the image of those bins in his mind, how new they had looked, how neatly they had been stacked, how out of place they seemed in a world where people usually stored old mattresses and cracked coolers. Part of him was already trying to make peace with the idea that they might hold nothing more than outdated clothes or cheap electronics. Another part, stubborn as an old tree root, couldn't stop wondering if, Just this once, something good was waiting behind a door for him instead of someone else. People who later heard what happened to him would sometimes say it sounded like the kind of story you'd stumble onto while watching videos about storage auctions and second chances, the kind that quietly asks you to leave a like or a comment if you enjoy hearing how ordinary lives can turn unexpectedly. If this were playing on a screen, this would be the moment to lean in a little closer, because for Frank, the real story didn't start when he bought the unit. It started the next morning, when he rolled back through the gate determined to open it. He came back just after the facility opened, the air cool and smelling faintly of asphalt and coffee from the office. The lot was quieter now, only a few cars scattered between rows of blue doors. Frank let his chair hum slowly down the drive until the number 37 appeared at eye level. For a long moment he simply sat there, listening to his own heartbeat, feeling the small weight of the key in his hand. He knew that whatever waited behind this door would not just fill his next 2 days, it would decide, in some hard-to-measure way, what the rest of his months might look like. When he finally slid the key into the lock and felt the shank turn, the sound was louder in his head than it was in the hallway. The metal latch lifted with a stiff reluctance, as if it had grown used to being left alone. He grasped the handle with both hands, braced his footplate, and began to pull. The door rolled up inch by inch, letting in a thin strip of light that widened slowly across the floor. Shadows retreated toward the back wall, shapes emerging out of the dimness. The familiar outlines of the bins, the dark silhouettes of the suitcases, and, tucked just to the right where he was sure there hadn't been anything yesterday, the edge of something else. Frank narrowed his eyes and leaned forward, the hairs rising on his arms as he saw it more clearly for the first time. A low, heavy-looking wooden chest bolted to a pallet, its corners wrapped in metal, its surface scored with old scratches as if it had traveled long and far before ending up here. Someone had draped a dusty moving blanket over most of it, but the line of a thick brass padlock was unmistakable. Whatever he had bought, it was not just a row of plastic bins anymore. Frank spent the better part of the morning just staring at the wooden chest. It was unlike anything else in the unit, solid, dark, and unmistakably old. The brass padlock was tarnished but intact, and the edges of the blanket that had covered it were stiff with dust, like fabric that hadn't been touched in years. Around it, the plastic bins stood perfectly arranged, as though guarding whatever was inside that crate. It felt deliberate, like someone had packed this space not just to store things, but to protect a secret. He maneuvered his chair closer, the soft hum of the motor echoing faintly off the concrete walls. His hands trembled as he ran his fingers along the side of the chest. The wood was oak, heavy-grained and cold to the touch, with dents that told stories of long use. A corner chipped, a faint burn mark, initials carved deep enough to last lifetimes. Arched, the letters read. The same initials were faintly stenciled on the side of one of the bins behind it. He paused, his mind running through possibilities. Someone's name, maybe the original owner, or perhaps a company logo long forgotten. Frank had expected to find old clothes, maybe office supplies or a few boxes of sentimental junk. But this felt intentional, like someone had wanted it to be found, eventually, by whoever had the nerve to open it. He stared at the lock again and smiled ruefully. Even if he had a bolt cutter, there was no way he could use it from his chair. That's when he remembered the young worker from the day before, the tall kid who had helped guide him through the bidding crowd and later lifted the heavy bins back into place when Frank went to settle his payment. Ryan. That was his name. Frank had liked the kid, polite, easygoing, the kind who talked to him like a man, not like someone to be pitied. Ryan had mentioned working odd hours around the facility, helping clean out units for extra cash. Maybe he could help. Frank rolled backward, pulled out his phone, and found the number the kid had scribbled on a receipt the day before. 2 hours later, Ryan arrived, the sound of his truck echoing through the nearly empty lot. He climbed out, wiping his hands on a rag, and grinned when he saw Frank waiting by the half-open door of Unit 37. "You actually went through with it?" he said. "I did," Frank replied, smiling faintly. "And now I've got myself a problem I can't exactly lift." Ryan stepped inside, his boots crunching softly on the gravel-strewn floor. "That's one serious chest," he said, crouching beside it. "Looks like something out of a shipwreck movie." He tugged gently at the padlock, then shook his head. "This thing's solid. You want me to grab a cutter from the truck?" Frank hesitated for just a moment, then nodded. "Let's see what we're dealing with." While Ryan disappeared outside, Frank studied the rest of the unit more closely. The bins were immaculate, almost too neat. Each one had been labeled in block letters with faded masking tape: winter, kitchen, books, office. It looked ordinary enough, except that the handwriting matched the carved initials on the chest. Whoever RH had been, they were organized, meticulous. The first bin he opened contained rows of tightly wrapped packages, books, by the feel of them, all hardcovers, bound in leather or cloth. The titles were mostly history, art, architecture. Each had a small, handwritten note tucked between the pages. Personal observations, sometimes just a line or two, in that same tidy hand. By the time Ryan returned, bolt cutter in hand, Frank was staring at a pile of old journals that looked more like museum pieces than something you'd find in an abandoned unit. "You find anything good?" Ryan asked, setting the cutter down beside the chest. "Not sure yet," Frank murmured. "But whoever owned this, they weren't your average storage renter." Ryan positioned the cutter and clamped down on the lock. The metal gave with a sharp crack, echoing through the space. He lifted the hasp and opened the lid slowly. A thin rush of stale air escaped, carrying the faint smell of cedar and something older, like the inside of a library that had been closed for decades. Inside, neatly arranged under a folded sheet of yellowed linen, was a collection of smaller boxes, wooden, tin, and one of dark velvet. Frank leaned forward, heart pounding. Ryan reached for the velvet box first, brushing off a layer of dust before handing it to him. Frank opened it carefully. Inside lay a small gold watch, its face cracked, but still gleaming faintly beneath the dust. The engraving on the back was delicate but readable. "For Robert, with all my love, Eleanor, 1948. Ryan let out a low whistle. "That's gotta be worth something." "Maybe," Frank said, his voice quiet. "But it's not about the money. Not yet." He looked at the rest of the chest. Beneath the velvet box were several envelopes bound together with a silk ribbon, their edges brittle with age. Each was sealed with wax. One had been broken long ago, revealing a folded letter inside. He glanced at the writing, neat and slanted, the same as in the journals. His fingers trembled slightly as he unfolded it. The first line read, "If you are reading this, then the chest has found its way into another pair of hands." Frank froze. The next few lines were shorter, hurried, as if written in distress. "There are things in here that were never meant to be sold. Please handle them with care. Some belong to people who may still be looking for them." He glanced up at Ryan, who had noticed his silence. "Everything all right?" the young man asked. Frank hesitated, then folded the letter again and slipped it back into its envelope. "I'm not sure," he said slowly, "but I think we might have just opened something we shouldn't have." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The faint hum of distant traffic was the only sound. Then Ryan gave a small, uncertain smile. "Well, guess that's part of the adventure, right?" Frank didn't answer. He just looked at the chest, the journals, the letters, the watch, and wondered what kind of life could fit into such small, careful pieces. Outside, a breeze rattled the thin metal walls of the unit. The sound was soft but steady, like a whisper reminding him that every discovery came with a price. And though Frank didn't know it yet, the contents of that chest would change far more than just his finances. By the time they sealed the unit again for the night, both men were silent. Ryan offered to come back the next morning to help sort through the rest. Frank agreed, even though he knew he wouldn't sleep much. There were too many questions now, about RH, about Eleanor, about what could be hidden in the rest of those boxes. And one, above all, why would someone so meticulous, so careful, just stop paying for something like this? When he finally wheeled himself toward the bus stop, the sun was already dipping low, turning the storage rose golden. The brass lock, now broken and hanging loose, caught the last light and flashed briefly like a signal, as if the past itself had just been set free. Tomorrow, Frank told himself, they'd dig deeper. Tomorrow maybe he'd learn who Robert H. really was. Frank returned to the storage unit early the next morning, long before the rest of the facility came alive. The air was sharp and cool, carrying the faint scent of rain-soaked asphalt and engine oil. He had hardly slept. His mind had spent the night replaying the words from that letter, the careful script that spoke of things that were never meant to be sold. It had unsettled him, not because it warned of danger, but because it carried the quiet gravity of truth. Whoever had written it hadn't been careless or dramatic. They had been intentional. Inside Unit 37, the air was still heavy with dust, but it no longer smelled like neglect. It smelled like history, a mixture of old paper, cedar, and time. The broken padlock lay on the floor near the chest, a mute witness to the previous day's discovery. Morning light filtered through the open door, casting long bars of gold across the bins and boxes. It made the space look almost reverent, like a room in a forgotten museum. Frank moved slowly, examining each bin one at a time. The labels were tidy, deliberate, and when he opened them, the contents matched the precision of the handwriting. One bin contained carefully folded linens wrapped in tissue, embroidered with initials and years: 1935, 1942, 1950. Another held stacks of photo albums, the pages thick and yellowed, filled with black and white portraits of people who carried the same quiet confidence as the handwriting on the letters. None of the faces were familiar, yet each seemed oddly specific, as if they expected someone to remember them. He noticed patterns, repetition in the initials, the same RH appearing on nearly every object, sometimes alongside another. The pair seemed inseparable, as though the story of one could not exist without the other. In the bottom of one bin, under a folded quilt, he found a small, hand-bound notebook. Inside were entries written in the same elegant hand. The dates began in the late 1940s and continued through the mid-1960s. Each entry was concise, but not cold, more like fragments of someone trying to preserve moments that would otherwise disappear. The first page reads simply, "Eleanor prefers the beach in winter. The light there makes the world quiet." Frank read on, tracing each word as though it might explain the strange energy that seemed to hum through the unit. There were no confessions, no dramatic revelations, just an accumulation of life. Notes about places, colors, sounds. Lists of items to be kept safe. And then, halfway through the notebook, a phrase that stopped him. "The collection is complete. All pieces marked and stored. Ownership must remain private." He looked up at the bins again. There was no mention of what the collection meant, but now the neatness of the space made sense. Everything here was deliberate, intentional. These were not random belongings from a forgotten life. They were curated artifacts. But curated for what? The day passed quietly as Frank continued to sort. Occasionally, a faint hum of engines or distant voices broke the silence, but mostly the world seemed to pause around him. Every box revealed another layer of the same mystery, valuable in small, subtle ways. Old fountain pens in pristine cases, silver-framed photographs, envelopes of film negatives. All items that would mean little to a stranger, but together formed something cohesive, like chapters of a book with missing pages. By midday, Ryan had arrived again to help lift the heavier containers. His arrival broke the stillness but didn't shatter it. He worked quietly, sensing Frank's focus. Together, they created small stacks of the opened bins and labeled them for cataloging. Ryan, curious but respectful, didn't ask many questions. Frank appreciated that. He preferred silence. It gave him room to think. As they worked, Frank noticed something subtle, a consistency across several boxes, a faint smell of oil and metal polish, and on the underside of each lid, a number written in pencil. At first, they seemed random, 12, 43, 87, but soon a pattern emerged. They weren't random at all. They formed a sequence, almost like coordinates or catalog entries. Each bin, he realized, was part of something larger, like drawers in a vast unseen archive. When they reached the last unopened bin, heavier than the rest, Frank insisted on being the one to open it. His hands shook slightly, not from weakness but anticipation. The lid creaked as he pried it free, revealing something unexpected, not books or household items, but a set of thick metal plates, stacked carefully and separated by sheets of cloth. Each was etched with intricate engravings, geometric shapes, numbers, faint lines like maps without names. The edges were worn smooth from handling. They looked scientific, but also artistic, like something made by a craftsman who understood both precision and beauty. Frank leaned closer, his reflection distorted across the surface. The engravings were faint, but one line stood out clearly. Property of RH Engineering, 1952. He sat back, processing the words. These weren't just keepsakes, they were prototypes, or blueprints in another form. The kind of thing that might have been locked away when a company dissolved or a patent dispute went unresolved. He had seen old industrial tools before, but never anything that carried both this age and this kind of care. He turned the top plate over carefully, revealing something scrawled on the underside in fading ink. To be opened only by family. For a long time, he didn't move. The air in the unit seemed thicker, pressing close, as if it were aware that he had crossed some invisible threshold. The discovery no longer felt like luck or chance. It felt like responsibility. Frank thought about what it meant, about how easily things were forgotten. Maybe RH had died without anyone left to claim his work. Maybe Eleanor had tried to preserve what was left and simply ran out of time or money. Whatever had happened, it was clear that someone had cared deeply for these things. As the afternoon sun slanted through the open doorway, Frank knew he couldn't just sell everything, not yet. Not until he understood. He made notes in his small spiral pad, item descriptions, initials, numbers, and packed the plates away with deliberate care. By the time Ryan wheeled the last empty bin aside, the sky outside had shifted from gold to gray. Frank locked the unit again, this time replacing the broken padlock with a new one. He kept the key in his pocket, turning it over and over in his palm. He didn't know what the numbers meant or who RH had been, but one thing was clear. This storage unit was not an accident. It was a message sent forward through time, waiting for someone patient enough to listen. That night, back in his small apartment, the hum of the refrigerator was the only sound. Frank laid the notebook open on the table and traced the ink-stained words again. Ownership must remain private. He understood the sentiment, but a new thought began to grow, quiet and persistent. If something this detailed, this deliberate, had been lost to time, maybe it was never meant to stay hidden. Maybe what he had stumbled upon wasn't just someone's collection. Maybe it was a piece of history that had been quietly waiting for a second life. And somewhere deep down, Frank already knew, this discovery was far from over. The next morning arrived gray and heavy, the kind of sky that seemed unsure whether to rain or clear. Frank reached the storage facility early again, the chill air biting at his hands as he guided his wheelchair across the gravel. The place felt different now, less like a business and more like a threshold. Each time he approached Unit 37, it seemed to hold its breath, as though the very air inside waited for him to continue what he had started. When the door rolled open, the thin light of dawn fell across the neat rows of bins and the dark wooden chest. The order of everything felt almost ceremonial. He began to catalog the items properly this time, one box at a time, a process he knew from years of stockroom work. Only now, instead of product numbers and barcodes, he was recording fragments of a vanished life. Dates, initials, descriptions that sounded more like whispers than inventory, handwritten letters, oil sketches, metal plates with coded markings. Each new discovery brought both satisfaction and unease. There was a rhythm to the work, but it was the rhythm of something being revealed, not simply sorted. The journals and notebooks fascinated him most. Their pages were a conversation between precision and emotion, equations alongside sketches of sea horizons, careful measurements sharing space with notes about moonlight, temperature, and sound. It was as though the person who had written them had been trying to measure the world not only with numbers but with feeling. The tone shifted as the years advanced. Early entries spoke of collaboration, of we, while later pages grew solitary, more restrained, until only I remained. The handwriting itself began to shake, lines tightening as if the writer had grown older or lonelier. Among the documents, Frank found a thin envelope labeled simply Blueprint I. Inside was a folded sheet of parchment lined with intricate drawings, not of a machine, exactly, but of something that resembled a combination of sculpture and instrument. Strange spirals surrounded a central disc, annotated with terms like resonance chamber and wave translation prototype. Frank stared at it for a long time, the precision of the work too refined to be a mere experiment. Whatever RH had been building, it had required both science and faith, and perhaps more time than anyone had been willing to give. By mid-morning, the storage unit had filled with the quiet rhythm of discovery. The air thickened with dust each time a lid was lifted, particles dancing in the pale light like memories suspended in motion. Frank paused often to stretch his hands, each movement reminding him of how long it had been since his body had been asked to work for something that mattered. It felt strange to realize how alive he felt amid relics of the dead. The more he uncovered, the more deliberate it all seemed. Every bin, every letter, even the placement of the chest formed a pattern. It wasn't chaos, it was architecture, the design of someone who had trusted order to outlast their own memory. Frank began mapping it out on a scrap of cardboard, drawing small rectangles for each container and marking the numbers he had found beneath the lids. As the layout took shape, something remarkable emerged. The numbers weren't random. They followed a spiral, winding inward toward the center of the unit, directly toward the spot where the wooden chest had been bolted down. It was no coincidence. He could feel it in his bones. The bins had been arranged to mirror something, perhaps the very blueprint he had found. He studied the diagram again, tracing the curved lines with the tip of his pencil. The more he compared them, the clearer it became. The storage unit itself had been arranged as a miniature model of the drawing. The realization unsettled him. He was standing, or rather sitting, in the middle of a design built by someone long gone. Whoever RH was, they had used this 10 by 10 room as a final repository, not just of objects, but of meaning. The chest was not the treasure itself, it was the heart of a structure. For a moment, Frank allowed himself to imagine the person behind all this. A man perhaps, once young, brilliant, meticulous, someone who built machines that no one understood and who slowly watched the world forget him. Or maybe it was Eleanor, the woman from the inscription on the watch, who had tried to preserve his legacy after his passing. Maybe she had built this small cathedral of bins to protect what he'd left behind. Whatever the truth, one fact grew clearer with every passing hour. This was not storage. It was devotion. Outside, the light shifted as the sun broke through the clouds. Dust glittered like frost in the air. Frank paused, feeling the quiet weight of the discovery. For the first time in years, his days were filled with purpose. His hands hurt, his back ached, and his wheelchair's battery was running low, but he couldn't stop. Not yet. By late afternoon, his notebook was full of notes and sketches. Each word carried the weight of reverence, not for money, not even for the thrill of discovery, but for the care it took to create something so precise and then trust it to time. When he finally rolled the door down for the evening, he looked back once more at the closed space. In the fading light, Unit 37 no longer seemed like a place of chance or luck. It looked like something waiting to be understood, a message written in dust and patience. Frank knew he would return tomorrow. And somewhere deep inside, though he couldn't explain why, he felt that the story of RH was not yet finished, only paused, waiting for him to turn the next page. The rain came that night, a steady, whispering sound against Frank's window that blurred the line between waking and memory. Sleep came in pieces, flashes of numbers, the carved initials, the spiral pattern winding endlessly inward. He woke before dawn, a faint ache in his chest, not of pain but anticipation. He needed to know what the message meant, what the purpose of the pattern was. By the time he reached the facility, the storm had passed, leaving behind a gray quietness that felt like the pause between breaths. The pavement was slick, reflecting the pale light of morning. He rolled through puddles that mirrored the blue doors and stopped before Unit 37. The new lock gleamed with moisture, small beads of water catching on his fingers as he turned the key. Inside, everything was exactly as he'd left it. The air smelled faintly metallic, a reminder of the tools and the long-forgotten engineering work. But there was something else, a warmth in the stillness, a sense of continuity, as if the room itself acknowledged his return. He began moving the bins again, aligning them according to the spiral he had drawn the day before. The motion was slow and deliberate. With each adjustment, the pattern on his sketch matched the floor a little more precisely. When the final bin slid into place, he realized that the spiral ended at a single point, the exact center of the unit. The spot where, just hours earlier, the heavy chest had sat. There was nothing mystical about it, yet the design felt intentional, as though the chest had been placed not randomly, but as the heart of a mechanism, an anchor holding the rest together. Frank positioned himself before the empty pallet and studied the space. There, faint but visible beneath the dust, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, shallow scratches forming a circle etched into the concrete. Not drawn, but cut. The grooves were deliberate, worn by time but unmistakable. He leaned forward, tracing the arc with his fingertip. Inside the circle, someone had etched a sequence of letters, not words, but abbreviations. And 45, E122. Coordinates. He felt a slow shiver crawl up his spine. They were too precise to be random. Somewhere, those numbers pointed to a real place. Frank turned to the journals again, flipping through until he found a page dated 1956. The handwriting was hurried, the ink slightly smeared, but the lines were clear. Project completed. Data secured. Secondary vault location noted, 45N122E. Do not disturb until confirmation. He stared at the words, his pulse heavy in his temples. The storage unit wasn't the vault. It was a map to it. Whatever RH had been working on, the designs, the metal plates, the recorded measurements, they were part of something larger, something hidden somewhere far beyond these walls. For a long time, he sat there in silence, the air around him humming faintly as if echoing the thought. The truth pressed against him with quiet insistence. He would never know the full story. The man who built this structure, or the woman who preserved it, was gone. Whatever had been hidden at those coordinates might have long since been erased, destroyed, or buried under decades of change. But in this small, forgotten unit, their devotion remained. Frank realized he didn't need to find the vault. He already had what mattered, the proof that a lifetime of work hadn't disappeared into nothing. Someone had believed enough in what they built to preserve it with care and precision, trusting that someday, someone would notice. He spent the rest of the afternoon cleaning the unit, returning each object to its original place, the spiral intact. When he was done, he labeled every box carefully and stacked the journals on the chest. Then, for the first time, he closed the door not with the curiosity of a seeker, but with the respect of a guardian. As he rolled away, the rain began again, soft, steady, almost musical. He looked back only once, watching as the last trace of sunlight caught the edge of the blue door, turning it to a dull gold. The world would never know about the quiet brilliance of RH or the devotion of the person who had saved his work. But Frank did. And for the rest of his days, that was enough. He had not just bought a forgotten storage unit. He had inherited someone's legacy, and in doing so, found a purpose of his own. The following day felt different, quieter, almost weightless. The questions that had haunted Frank all week no longer pressed against him with urgency. Instead, there was a steady calm, like the soft hum of a machine finally winding down after decades of running. He arrived at the storage facility just after sunrise, the sky still pale and empty, and unlocked the familiar blue door one last time. Inside, the air was still. Everything remained exactly as he had left it. The chest at the center, the bins arranged in their spiral pattern, and the faint scent of cedar and dust holding the space together like memory. Frank looked around slowly, taking in every corner. For the first time, it didn't feel like a mystery waiting to be solved. It felt like a life that had been properly seen. He spent the morning finishing his notes, labeling each item clearly, not for profit, but for preservation. The journals and sketches were stacked neatly in a crate, the letters tied carefully with twine. The gold watch rested on top, its cracked face glinting softly in the low light. He knew he could have sold everything. The watch alone would fetch more than enough to ease his monthly bills, but it didn't feel right. These objects weren't his to profit from. They were his to protect. When everything was finally organized, Frank sealed the chest again and placed it in the center of the spiral where it belonged. He replaced the new lock, tucked the key into a small envelope, and wrote a single line across it, To whoever finds this next, handle with care. As he rolled out of the unit, he paused in the doorway. The air outside smelled of rain and metal, the kind of scent that carried both endings and beginnings. The sunlight caught on the wet gravel, scattering small reflections like tiny stars. He thought of RH, of Eleanor, of the years of precision and patience that had gone into creating something the world had simply forgotten. And for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel small. He felt like part of a longer story, one that stretched backward and forward beyond anything he could see. He closed the door gently and listened to the echo as it latched shut. That sound, he realized, was the sound of peace, of something completed. The unit was no longer just a collection of lost belongings. It had become a monument to care, to work, to persistence. Frank lingered for a moment, watching the light change. Then, slowly, he turned his wheelchair toward the exit and began the quiet journey home. The gravel crunched beneath the wheels in steady rhythm, each turn marking an end and a beginning at once. The mystery of RH would remain unsolved, the coordinates unsearched, the blueprints unread by the world, but that was fine. Some legacies didn't need an audience, they just needed a witness. And Frank had been that witness. When the wind rose behind him, brushing against the row of metal doors, he smiled faintly. The storage unit would keep its secrets for now. But he knew, deep down, that something far greater had been unlocked, not in that room, but within himself. He had gone searching for forgotten things. And in the quiet heart of someone else's story, he had finally found his own.